just let everybody know we're going to be a couple minutes late. We're just waiting. Okay, council, I'm going to call the meeting to order. Hope everybody had a great weekend. It was a beautiful weekend. And to Councillor Bjorkman, I seen a lot of people down there at the beach in the park yesterday. It was nice to see, really nice. I was down there and with the grandson, and then Dan Boudreau showed up with his grandson, and here comes Richard Malash with 6 of them. It was nice to see all the kids together, but we had a great time. So anyways, I'm going to call the meeting to order. Any conflict amongst council members here tonight? Seeing none, I'll need a motion to adopt the published agenda here. Could I have a mover, please? Councillor Vanden and Councillor Bowman. All in favor? And that's carried. And I guess we'll go right to public presentations and go right to Nancy, if you're available. You ready?
I am. Thank you.
Hold on one sec, Nancy. Hold on one sec. Go ahead. Nancy, just hold on. We're going to go right to Lori first, okay? And we'll come back to you, Nancy.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you so much. I just wanted to take a quick minute to introduce the purpose of tonight's meeting. We are seeking public input and your input and representation of the public on mandatory changes to the mandatory updates required to our development charges bylaw so that we can be consistent with recent legislated changes under the Development Charges Act. So really, we need to amend our bylaw to be consistent with the Act. Our consultant, Nancy and Sabrina, are here, or maybe just Nancy, from Watson and Associates, to present you with a summary of what these mandatory amendments to the DC bylaw include. Although Nancy will brief you on all of the mandatory changes, we'd like you to pay close attention to the changes related to exemptions for second dwelling units, as well as timing of payment for rental housing, institutional land uses, nonprofit developments, as well as timing of payment for developments occurring within 2 years of approval of a site plan control application or 2 years of approval of a zoning bylaw amendment application. So there are some implications that we need to consider, and we'd like you to be mindful of moving forward with these amendments. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you again, Council. And the floor is yours, Nancy.
All right, great. Thank you, Lori. Good afternoon. I am going to share a presentation with you, so bear with me while I try and get that up on the screen for everyone to see. If you can let me know if you can see that now, that would be great. Okay, I see a couple of thumbs up, so thank you. I will walk you through the changes that have taken place in the Development Charges Act since you passed your bylaw in 2019, and explain why we're making the changes we are at this point and the implications of that on the town. So thanks for your opening remarks. Lori, I do want to, this is a formal public meeting of council to review this. At the end of it, if my presentation, if there's questions of council or the public, or if there's been any written submissions received that we need to respond to, we certainly can do that after the fact in writing. But if there's any questions tonight, I'm here to answer those. And then we will conclude the public meeting and we'll talk about the next steps, because there's still another meeting in the future needed to actually pass an amending bylaw. So as you know, with any change or update to a development charge, there is a need to have a public meeting under the Development Charges Act. And this one is really to provide an update to the existing bylaw to remove the 10% mandatory deduction that has been there in the past for some services, to incorporate a lot of the policy changes that have taken place as a result of Bills 108, 197, and 213 that were all passed last year and put in place. Again, it is to come back to you for consideration of bylaw, and we still are required to have that 60-day minimum circulation period of the background study before you can actually pass the amending bylaw. And that's why we'll be back to you in June for the bylaw passage. Just to give you a brief overview of the process, we started with working with staff actually late February, early March to go through all of the changes that are required to your policies in your bylaw, as well as the calculated rates for some of the services that are contained in your current development charges. We did release the report on April 6th, which started our public process. There was advertisement for tonight's public meeting in line with what the legislation requires. And then we'll be back to you June 21st for your consideration of the amending bylaw. Just as a brief overview, in case anyone's forgotten or anyone in the public listening in doesn't know, development charges are to recover the capital costs associated with both residential and non-residential growth within a municipality. And these are capital costs that are in addition to what normally is constructed as part of a development plan or subdivision, such as the internal roads, sewers and water mains, sidewalks, etc. So this is really the broader base projects that service multiple developments throughout the town. And you are empowered through the Development Charges Act to impose these charges versus having to collect for these types of works through other means that the Municipal Act allows you to do. As I mentioned, there has been a number of pieces of legislation that have changed since you passed your last bylaw. There's actually 4 pieces of legislation that have changed. Bill 108, the More Homes, More Choice Act, was introduced in 2019. Bill 138, the Plan to Build Ontario Together Act, was introduced later in 2019. And then in 2020, there was 2 pieces of legislation with the global pandemic that we are all facing. The COVID-19 Economic Recovery Act was introduced through Bill 197. And then late last year, in early December, Bill 213, Better for People, Smarter for Business Act, was also introduced and received royal assent very quickly, actually. So all 4 of these pieces of legislation made changes to the Development Charges Act. What Bill 108 was originally anticipating, we were working with when we were undertaking your 2019 study. But what ended up actually being put in place was slightly different than what the original intent was that we thought was going to be passed through Bill 108, because through Bill 138 and 197, there was amendments made to Bill 108. So, it's not necessary that you automatically and update your bylaw. However, there are pieces of the legislation that are in place, as Lori was mentioning, specifically regarding the timing of calculation of the development charges and the timing of payment. And the act actually overrides your current bylaw, and you have to adhere to those new pieces of legislation. However, it becomes very difficult for anyone who picks up your bylaw to know what the rules are for them in certain cases. So most municipalities are trying to update their bylaws this year so that it's in line with the current legislation and it's very transparent as to what you're actually going to impose and when you're going to impose it. Again, with the reduction or the removal of the 10% mandatory deduction from our calculations for some services, you now have the opportunity to increase the charges related to those services, and that's part of what we've done through this update as well. So give you a bit more detail on what happened with Bills 108 and 138. In May of 2019, Bill 108 was introduced. Some of those sections related to that timing of calculation and payment of the development charges were actually proclaimed in December of 2019 and became effective January 1st, 2020. Then there was other changes that didn't take place until September of last year, when full proclamation of Bill 108 and 197 were put in place. So what was put in place as of January 1st, 2020 was regarding the timing of payment for certain types of developments. So up to now, your development charges were typically paid at the time of building permit issuance. For certain types of developments now, including rental housing and institutional developments, instead of paying that development charge at the time of building permit issuance, they now pay at the time of occupancy of their buildings in 6 equal annual installments. So if I was to get my permit issued today and I occupied my new unit for a rental housing or institutional development in, say, July 1st, then I would make my first of 1/6 of my development charge payment on July 1st. And then every July 1st thereafter for 5 more years, I would continue to make 1/6 of that development charge payment. So it helps with some of the developments in spreading out the timing to help with cash flow for those types of developments. Nonprofit housing, you actually have to provide a 21 equal annual installment payment. Again, the first payment due upon occupancy, and then for 20 years thereafter, they pay 1/21st of the charge. So it does create administratively for staff a tracking that has to happen for any of these types of developments. The Act does allow you to pass an interest policy to provide or to apply interest to those installment payments over time. And that is something that can be done separate and outside of the bylaw, so that at some point, if you want to change that policy, it's easier to do it when it's in a policy outside the bylaw. As soon as you put that policy or that rate right in the bylaw, you have to actually go through a whole public process to change that rate in the future if you choose to. Okay. Going on with Bill 197, some of the other changes that were put in place included changing the list of eligible services. So in the past, the Development Charges Act used to say you can collect for any services that you have growth-related infrastructure costs to cover, to service that growth, except for, and then they listed a number of services that were ineligible. With Bill 197, what they've done is they've changed it around and they've said, now you can only collect for, and they've listed the services that you can collect for. For yourselves, luckily, the services you can collect for continue to be the same as what you've collected for in the past, with a couple minor tweaks, and I'll get into that. There are certain things that now have to be classified and grouped together as a class of service. So for example, growth studies. We used to just have a category of administration or growth studies. But that is not now a listed service. However, any studies that are undertaken that relate to specific services that are eligible can still be collected. So what the Act says is you can create a class of service called growth studies and continue to collect for your growth studies if they are eligible. So if you were doing a transportation master plan, because roads is eligible, the transportation master plan is eligible. If you were doing a water wastewater master plan, those services are still eligible, so would the studies be. There are a couple of studies that were on the list prior, and because they no longer relate to a service that is eligible, we've had to remove them. And that's resulted in a slight decrease to that administration or growth studies category that you've had in the past. However, a lot of those studies also had the 10% mandatory deduction in the calculations. And we've removed that deduction now, which has helped to bring that charge back up a bit. As well, one of the changes, and we haven't embraced it this time around, but we used to be limited for what they considered soft services versus hard services. So for things such as library and parks and recreation, we were limited to looking at a 10-year planning horizon of what you needed for growth. They've now removed that for all services except transit, for those that have transit. And what that means is during your next development charge study, full study, if you were to update a library master plan or a parks and rec master plan, for example, and it looked out 20 years, we could actually identify the growth that would service and add 20 years worth of costs into the development charge calculations, where right now we're limited to 10 years. So that piece, we haven't changed anything on right now for this minor update. You're still looking at a 10-year planning horizon for those softer services. Bill 197 also introduced a new charge called the community benefits charge. And originally through Bill 108, this was going to be much broader than what it has ended up being. It was originally going to be that all those soft services were going to be taken out of the development charge. And if municipalities chose to, they could recover it through a community benefit charge. But then through Bill 197, they put some of those services back in and left them as eligible under the development charge. What this means for community benefit charges is really, it's limited now for collection by only local tier and single tier municipalities. So in that case, the town would be eligible to put this in place. However, it's based on 4% of the market value of the land, of the property the day prior to building permit issuance, but it can only be applied to developments that have 5 or more stories and have 10 or more residential units. So in a lot of the smaller communities, you don't typically get high-rise developments that would fall into these categories. So a lot of municipalities are not choosing to put a community benefits charge in place. Now, if you did, you do have a 2-year transition period from September 18th of last year to get that in place. So you have up until September 18th of 2022 to get that in place. However, that is something that we haven't contemplated at the moment for you guys. And that's because so far you aren't losing any services in the in this study. Bill 213 was the last one that was put in place. May not apply for you, but just so that you're aware in case something happens in the future, what this bill has done is ensure that lands that are used or intended to be used for universities, where they receive funding from other levels of government, provincial or federal, they are mandatorily exempt from development charges now. So that doesn't apply to a private university, you know, Nancy Neal University. If I wanted to start something, that wouldn't apply to me because I'm not getting that higher level government funding. But for any other universities, if Waterloo University, for example, Windsor, if University of Windsor wanted to put a campus in Essex, they would be automatically exempt from paying development charges. Okay. So right now, as I mentioned, we are updating, or we have updated and removed the 10% deduction for what used to be your indoor and outdoor recreation services and your library services and those studies. Now, one of the other changes is indoor and outdoor recreation services has now been classified as an eligible service, but they call it Parks and Recreation Services. So it's combined now. So we've embraced that combination as well through this update. And then back when we were doing the 2019 study, because Bill 108 had been released and we were hearing that any of the soft services were going to be taken out of the development charge, we had split that administration or growth studies component into 2 different components, assuming that the studies related to those softer services would end up being taken out of your DC as well. They weren't. So we've now combined them all back into one category and called it growth studies and declared it as the class of service that is necessary. The other area is public works operations, facilities, vehicles, and equipment that we have to declare as a class of service because public works is not an eligible service on the list of eligible services now. However, those facilities, vehicles, and equipment do support roads, water, wastewater, which are eligible services. So all we've done there is declare it a class of service. It doesn't change the calculated charges that were in the background study in 2019. The other thing that we need to make sure in the bylaw is we're embracing all of the wording and rules and regulations that are necessary. So as I was mentioning earlier with that installment payment freeze, we've updated the wording in your bylaw to embrace that so that it's transparent as to what those installment payments are. And Lori had mentioned this earlier as well. Another change with Bill 108 and Bill 197 was that there's now a freeze on the rate in place. So if I come in with today with a site plan application or an application for an amendment to the zoning bylaw, my rate is actually locked in. My development charge rate is locked in at today's date. And then from today, it might take, say, 2 months to get my application approved. From that date that my application is approved, I have 2 more years to get my building permit issued, and I still pay today's development charge rate. So the lag between application and approval, you want to ensure is as short as possible going forward. And you want to make sure that when I'm coming in today, I'm coming in with a full, complete application so that you can properly vet it and move it through the process for approval as quickly as possible, and then give me my 2 years. So what that does is it potentially provides cash flow issues if applications take a long time to get approval. That is another area where you can, if you choose to, apply interest though to today's rates to help take into account any inflationary factors you may be losing through indexing of the development charge annually. So we have brought that into the wording. There's also a new mandatory exemption for new ancillary residential units. So in the past, if I had a single family home and I wanted to add 1 or 2 additional apartments in it, I could do that without having to pay a development charge. And if I had any other type of home other than a single family, I was allowed to add 1 additional unit. But that was to an existing building. What used to be, if I was coming in with a new building permit for a single family home, plus I wanted to put an apartment in my unit or outside my unit, maybe on top of a detached garage or a granny flat or garden suite, as they're known to be, I would have to pay for both my new single family home and that other apartment or granny flat. Now what the legislation has said is I can come in with my new permit for my new home, and I can also get that ancillary unit, whether it's within the unit or on the same site, and I'm exempt from that second ancillary unit. So that's a nuance that's been put in this time around, and we've embraced that in the wording of the amending bylaw. As well, as I mentioned, the mandatory exemption for universities has been added in there. And then there was a few other additional definitions that needed to be either refined that you had or added just based on the way the legislation is worded. We needed to provide refinements to some of your definitions or additions to definitions that didn't exist. For example, an ancillary residential unit. We have now had to define what that is in your bylaw. When we've updated the charges, because your bylaw was based in 2019, we went back and we looked and we said, really, the growth forecast that we embraced back in the last study hasn't changed. We're still anticipating that over this forecast period, you're going to get that growth. We did update some of the that historic service standard calculation that was required. But really what we're doing is we're not passing a new bylaw, we're amending the old bylaw or the existing bylaw. So we're still amending the calculations in 2019 dollars. Obviously you have indexed the charges since then annually with your bylaw, and that indexing still applies to the updated calculations as well. But we're restating what the bylaw table is in 2019 dollars to stay consistent with the 2019 bylaw as it was passed. So the charges that were in place that you passed, that we calculated are here. You know, there was $8,179 for a single family home. And then depending on what ward you were in, there was also area specific wastewater charges. And there was similar different types of charges for other types of residential units. And then the non-residential is the calculated rate. Now, currently, your bylaw exempts non-residential developments of any kind from paying DCs, but we have still updated what the calculated rates were and would be under the new rules. But we have not changed the fact that you're still exempting non-residential at this point. That would be a council decision if you chose to start implementing a portion or all of that charge in the future. What that means for the rates is, and I've highlighted the 3 items that we're changing. And you can see that basically we're going to be increasing on a single family home from $8,095 up to $8,308. Okay, again, still in 2019 dollars. And then the non-residential would actually go down by 1 cent if you were per square foot, if you were actually imposing it, which you're not at the moment. What that means just overall in Essex County and your counterparts, you really haven't changed from your current to your calculator. It's really a minor step for each of the wards, but really in the overall picture, you haven't really changed where you fall in the county for comparison of your development charge rates to others. And then again, for your commercial, non-residential, you're still imposing 0 versus other municipalities that actually are imposing non-residential charges. And similarly for your industrial, you're still anticipated to not be imposing the charges versus a few of your counterparts. So the next steps, as I mentioned, is really coming back on June 21st and getting the approval of the amending bylaw. And that is my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that council or the public has.
Nancy, for your presentation, quite detailed. I will go right to, as soon as we get it up on the screen, council, and I'll see if there's any questions. Go ahead. Any questions from council? Any questions at all? Councillor Bjorkman, go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for that great presentation there, Nancy, and having a chance to look at it ahead of time. I guess my one question is with regard to the annual equal payments for the different types of projects. Is there a limit to that? Like, is there a prime plus one? Like, are we held to something as far as what we can charge in that time?
Through the chair, no, at this point, the Development Charges Act has not prescribed an interest rate. So it is up to each municipality as to what you want to impose on those installment payments and or on the freeze of the charges at site plan or zoning bylaw application. Other municipalities have done the same for both instances, the installments and the freeze. Some have done a different percentage for the installments versus the freeze. And there's a wide range. Some have just said it's going to be 5% annually. Others have based it on prime plus one, prime plus two. It's kind of all over the map out there, to be honest with you. There's really not a consistent way, although a lot of where there is two-tiered systems and there's bylaws in place by both tiers, like the upper tier and lower tier in some of the regions and counties, they are at least trying to coordinate within themselves to have similar interest rates so that the regions or the counties aren't charging something different than what the local municipalities are. So, but other than that kind of coordination, there is not any kind of coordination throughout the province at this point. And to date, the province has said they're not going to prescribe a rate.
Okay, thank you very much.
That could change at some point too.
That's for sure. Thank you.
Sorry, you wanted to add something? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Bjorkman, and I'm glad that question was posed. Tonight we do have a deputy treasurer. I don't see that Mr. Morrison is here tonight, but we do have Ms. Jarusevich joining us. I believe the team is working on something called a interest rate policy that will be brought forward to council in the next few weeks before June 21st, before that decision is set to be made on the amending DC bylaw, so we can have that interest rate in line at the same time, ready to go. So if I could, Mr. Mayor, pass that pass the mic to Kate to be able to speak to that.
Go ahead, Kate. You're all set.
Hi there, through the chair. Yes, so Nancy has been kind enough to forward us a few sample bylaws. However, Nancy pointed out earlier that we should separate it out of this amendment. So I am going to be setting up administrative meetings. We'll be talking with the county. Right now, our usual policy internally when it comes to any type of financing would be prime plus 2%. So, you know, but we're going to evaluate these sample reports as well and be presenting a report to you, council.
Any other questions from council? Councillor Vandendolen, go ahead.
Through you, yes, a great report, very detailed, very complex too. And for that reason, I'd like to add, I'd like to ask for one addition, and that is on page 15 of 96. You've got the calculated rates 2019, and I'd like to see it done for the new rates as well. But we need to add them up. I mean, we shouldn't be forcing people to get out a calculator and figure out that the charges are actually $9,051 in Ward 2, and that they're $11,530 in Ward 1. I mean, the number should be there, and the number, by the way, is a lot lower for apartments and other multiples. But anyway, I think that should be in there. Thanks.
Through the chair, just to let you know, if you're talking about adding up so that we can see a total for Ward 1 with the wastewater, or Ward 2, 3, or 4, we can certainly do that. And before the June 21st meeting, ensure that the schedule to the bylaw includes those totals for each of the 4 wards. That's no problem.
Nancy, just to Councillor Vandendolen, you're freezing up a little bit again. So, but we caught what you said. But anyways, okay. Anybody else? Deputy Mayor Malash, go ahead.
Yes, I just have a question on secondary dwelling units. So are there development charges on the secondary dwelling unit?
Through the chair, if the secondary dwelling unit is coming in at the same time as the new dwelling unit, then the larger of the 2 units is chargeable. The other one is now exempt. If the secondary dwelling unit is coming in as an addition to an existing unit, then the old rules still apply. I can add 1 or 2 additional apartments within my house, as long as I don't more than double the size of my existing house, then they're exempt. If I have any other type of residential home, a semi-detached, a townhouse, an apartment, I'm allowed to add 1 additional unit inside that home without having to pay. The new one is, the change is really for a brand new build, where I used to be able to, in a brand new build, charge for both units. Now I can only charge for the 1.
Okay, further. So
Go ahead.
Mayor, thank you. So Nancy, like, let's say I wanted to convert my garage, either, there's 2 things. Let's say I wanted to convert my garage into a secondary dwelling unit, but also, let's say I didn't have a garage, but I wanted to build a separate garage with an apartment over top. And I didn't currently have a garage.
So the garage itself is accessory to the residential use and wouldn't be charged. Unless it was, you know, there are some people that put massive garages and they actually conduct a business out of it.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm a mechanic and I'm just going to conduct my business out of it, that's then becomes a commercial entity that is taxed differently and would be charged if you were imposing a non-residential charge. But if it's just a garage for a house, because I didn't have one before, I can add that garage on and there's no DC. If I want to add it on and also put an apartment on it, you have the existing home. So the question then becomes, if you read specifically the act, it says that the unit has to be within the house. So if it's all going to be attached, it would be exempt. The nuance is, because you have the existing home, if it's a detached garage and it has an apartment over it, technically, based on the legislation, you could charge for that additional unit. It's up to you to determine in your bylaw if that's really any different, because there's 2 feet between the house wall and the garage wall and the apartment's on top of that versus it being attached. It's pretty much the same, but there is a slight technicality in there that, depending on how your bylaw is set up, you could charge for it when you have an existing home, if it's not attached. Once it's attached, yes, it's definitely exempt. There's that little gray area, and I would suggest that, a slight separation between the house and a detached garage with an apartment on it really is no different than whether or not it was attached to your house or not.
Okay, thank you very much.
But there's a kind of a glitch there in the legislation, I must admit.
Lori, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very muddy. It sounds to me, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It sounds to me that it is quite muddy. Ironically, Nancy, to you, I think we've spoken about this as well. This council and our municipality is undergoing a background study now in second dwelling units, and attempting to make regulations and changes in policies to allow, I guess, more flexibility for a property owner to be able to build either a attached second dwelling unit or detached. And Ms. Jabbour, our manager of planning services, is here to listen in on all great things development charges. But as you know, Ms. Jabbour wears this hat of planning policy advisor and zoning bylaw guru and all sorts of things. So Rita's hard at work right now working on some changes to those regulations that we spoke about, council, a couple of weeks ago, I believe. And we'll be bringing forward some further regulations in the zoning bylaw amendment for council's consideration on second dwelling units. Looking at the development charges for those second dwelling units, this is where things are not so much muddy, but to Nancy, I didn't want to cut you off, but you were going to say there was something that just a little bit more that you were going to clarify. But in our municipality, correct me if I'm wrong, Rita, we are not going to put forward recommendations that will allow a attached and a detached second and third dwelling unit. So in other words, our municipality, we're going to have that your main dwelling unit, and then it's going to be an either or scenario, an attached or a detached. Rita, if you want to jump in at any time, I believe that's what we're going to propose. I don't want to muddy those waters even more, but regardless, the second dwelling unit would be exempt from development charges.
Rita, did you want to add anything to that?
So through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. We are not going to propose, both the second dwelling unit be permitted in the house and in an accessory building. It's going to be in either or situation where you get the option of either putting it in your house or in an accessory building, but not in both. Of course, that's still up to council.
Thank you, Rita. Anybody else from council have a question?
Sorry, just through the chair.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, if that's the case, we have to then make sure in the draft amending bylaw that it's clear that whether it's attached or detached, you'd exempt it. And that might just be a minor tweak that we have to do to the bylaw prior to it being passed. If council chooses that that's the way that you're going to go and that's the rule. So hopefully over the next couple of weeks, that's sorted out. And before the June 21st meeting, you have up until that night to make any refinements to the draft amending DC bylaw. So we'll just want to make sure it's embraced in the way in which you've chosen to exempt those properties.
Nancy. Anybody else from council? Councillor Bjorkman, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you. Just one other question, and I get this mixed up, man. I have people ask me the question. So just going through the rest of the report there, when we look at the charges for the different types of things that can be built, a single and semi-detached. So get this one. So the charge, just start, the first one is $1,500 for single and semi-detached. Is that one charge for single and one charge for semi-detached, or is that two charges for the semi-detached? Just so I have this straight.
Through the chair. Through the chair, yes, it would be that rate times 2 because it's 2 units. And a attached home is not a second dwelling or an accessory dwelling unit.
Okay, so I would suggest in the future, we break out single and semi-detached. So when just everybody's are looking at these charts and they see single and semi-detached are 1,500, 979, 427, it's not. A single is those. A semi-detached is double that.
Right, each side is that amount.
I think it's important we have separate columns for that so people are very clear, because we get into this conversation when people are trying to build these places. And that when I read that, that's what it tells me. Either single or semi-detached, that's the charge. So
Okay.
I would suggest a little expansion of the graph there.
Okay.
Thank you, Counselor. That's a good point to clarify that. Anybody else? I see nobody else. So, Nancy, I want to thank you for the report. It was very detailed. And there was a lot in that report. So at this point here, I'll need a motion to accept the presentation, please. I can have a motion, Councillor Bjorkman and Councillor Guerin. All in favor? It's carried. Once again, Nancy, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Have a good night, all.
So at this point here, Deputy Mayor Malash, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something? Go ahead. No? Okay, at this point here, I'm going to call for adjournment until our next meeting. I need Deputy Mayor Malash and Councillor Vanendol. All in favor? That's great. I'll see you guys at 6 o'clock. Well, before we go, I just, Deputy Mayor Malash, you can chair the meeting next Monday. Okay, I'm going to take a 2-week vacation. So just let council know. So all in favor of adjournment?